I've spent the last 3 days preparing for this entry. It's definitely going to be complicated. I've got like 2+ pages of notes here. What I'm going to do is show some evidence that I have not included in my papers about Edgar Allan Poe and the Raven, which shows what Mathew Franklin Whittier's attitude was towards Poe's theft of the Raven as of 1861. This is another little piece of evidence. I think it's a pretty compelling piece of evidence, but there's quite a bit of background, and as always, there's some controversy about Mathew's authorship of certain pseudonyms. We're going to have to address those issues as well. I mean, if the pseudonym is contested, there's no point in my just asserting that that was Mathew Franklin Whittier, because the obvious answer is no, that was so-and-so. See, so in many of these cases, because Mathew kept himself so well hidden, other people ended up with the attributions, and I have to disprove that. I have to prove that that was Mathew's work before I can use that as evidence. See? So this is just so deeply buried that this is necessary. So what we're doing is we're going to the Portland transcript in Portland, Maine. Let's see, this is the February 2nd, 1861 edition of the Portland transcript. And what had happened was that there was a piece published in the December 1, 1860 edition of the Portland transcript, and it's supposed to be a poem supposedly channeled from Edgar Allan Poe. So what we need to do first is to read that poem. I need to read it in its entirety, and before I make any pronouncements on it, I'll let you get a sense of what it's like. So forgive the length of this. It's a page long. So it's called The Haunted Room. Ne'er when the first lamps are lighted, and atween the dusk and day, memory's shadowy form comes faintly from the long since passed away. That's P-A-S-T, passed away. Dare I pass into its shadow, for within the door there stands a phantom sad that watcheth me and beckoneth with its hands. The red light falleth on its face, and gleaming as of old, the eyes gaze on me, only now how passionless and cold. One night, like that young Danish prince, my heart beat brave and strong, and to the shade I softly said, lead on, I fear no wrong. A smile gleamed faintly o'er the face, then like a sunbeam fled. It clasped my hands, it led me on, yet never word it said. It passed beneath a picture rare, where long and long ago I sat with one, God guard his soul, who loved me then, I know. Eros and Psyche weeping, love parting from its soul, tears, lovers' tears, that was the tale the painter's art had told. Then to my heart a memory came, a scene of bygone years, when 'neath this very picture stood lovers in bitter tears. And like the falling autumn leaves, sad thoughts came thick and fast. I tried to speak, for then I knew that phantom of the past, whose grave, sad eyes were watching me, whose hands still clasped my own, but utterance failed, for memory held a prisoner each tone. Once more I strove to speak, and then the magic spell gave way. I fell, and fainting on the haunted chamber floor I lay. And when the first lamplight glimmers on the red walls of the room, never dare I let my foot fall in its haunted evening gloom, for the phantom ever stands there watching with its sad, sad eyes, filling full my weary heart with a pain that never dies. This is signed as of November 9, 1860. It's signed with 4 stars. Mathew used 1 star. Now, in my estimation, it's utterly horrible. It's a terrible knockoff on the Raven. And I'll analyze it bit by bit towards the end of this video if you make it that far. But it's just awful. It's awful. I don't think it's great poetry, but it's awful psychologically and spiritually, okay? So that being the case now, we have some other people that weigh in on this. People would write in and one would be pro and one would be con, and they'd argue back and forth and so on. That was an established protocol of the day. So we have one signing IW, who he doesn't profess any great knowledge of spiritualism, but he does make the one comment that this lady, Miss Doughton, Lizzie Doughton, I believe her name was, that he does know that she was a poet, that he'd met her personally. She'd shared a couple printed poems with him that she had published. So it wasn't just like any ignoramus that couldn't write poetry that suddenly gets in a trance and starts spouting poetry. So the obvious explanation for this is that she's lying about being in a trance, that she's written these poems herself, that she's a fan of Edgar Allan Poe, and she has mimicked, she thinks she has written in the style of the Raven, which she obviously hasn't, but she thinks she has. She's memorized it. She pretends to be in a trance, and she gives this recitation. See? And the whole question of this authenticity of this revolves around the question of, could she have written this poem? And what this fellow is saying, obviously, yes, she could have. Then in the December 29th edition, somebody signing Cana Fides, C-A-N-A-F-I-D-E-S, which according to Google Translate is Latin for gray faith, he writes in, and he lambasts IW and says that, yes, she was in trance and she couldn't possibly have come up with this poem on her own, and her own work by herself is not nearly as wonderful. And he just praises this poetry to the skies. And based on the false assumption that this is wonderful poetry and that she could not have written it on her own, he says it's proof of spiritualism, proof of channeling, see? Well, Mathew Franklin Whittier had been a champion of spiritualism in the 1850s. He was a member of the Portland Spiritualist Association. He had investigated physical mediumship in a scientific manner in 1855 and put his own name to it. I'm sure he still believed in spiritualism as of 1860 and 1861, but there was an increasing number of frauds, and I think he was getting disgusted with the frauds. So, of course, he has a major bone to pick with Edgar Allan Poe with regard to the Raven, because Edgar Allan Poe had falsely claimed that poem and gotten away with it because Matthew wasn't in a position to defend himself publicly. So he knows that this is phony channeling. He knows that the poem is typical of the kind of thing that Edgar Allan Poe might write, because this lady is a big fan of Edgar Allan Poe and imitating him. But it's nothing at all like the Raven. If you look at the Raven, you'll see that that's an esoteric Christian struggling with a faith crisis. It's not somebody writing in imagination who was an atheist and didn't believe in any of it, see? It just took it as a ghost story, or what they call a Gothic horror poem. That was Edgar Allan Poe's take on the Raven, and that's because he was ignorant of these things, see? So his fans naturally are similarly ignorant, and they produce similar nonsense. Well, Matthew knew that, and what he wanted to do was to write a parody of the poem in such a way that he's attacking Edgar Allan Poe, but not necessarily spiritualism per se. And that's precisely what he does, and it appears in the February 2nd, 1861 edition. And I'm going to go ahead and read that to you. This is called The Blower, and what they mean by a blower apparently is an attachment to a furnace. They actually did have such a thing back in the day. It was designed by the Root brothers, Philander and Francis Root, apparently. And in the history, it's hard to find any examples of it this early attached to a furnace, but obviously we have the evidence here that it was. Matthew had been a stove salesman, so he knew the ins and outs of stoves well. So this is called The Blower. It's set in Matthew's fictional town of Hornby, where Ethan Spike, his main character, resides, and several other characters. So this is a spiritualist trance medium in Hornby who supposedly channels this poem. The other night, as I was seated near, and you'll see that this is in the meter more or less of the Raven. So it's obvious the reference that he's making. The other night, as I was seated near the open door, feeling rather too much heated. Kate, I cried, remove the blower. This I said, and nothing more, except perhaps that I repeated, somewhat loud, remove the blower. In she came, no greater slattern, scuffing on the floor, and her garment, what a pattern, soiled behind and soiled before, and holes, why you might count a score. She'd been drinking, too, with Nat Hearn, and, though tipsy, called for more. Then I threw the poker at her, threw as I never threw before, for I meant her hide to batter, till 'twas black and blue and sore, and she tumbled on the floor. Take the blower, wretch, and scatter, but she answered, nevermore. In the midst of this confusion, in rushed neighbors 3 or 4, and I asked, why this intrusion without knocking at the door? Your proceedings I ignore. And I muttered in conclusion, Deacon Sanders, you're a bore. Then the deacon, raising finger, asked the cause of this uproar. This insult from the old psalm singer touched me to the very core. Shouldn't wonder if I swore. Deacon, cried I, do not linger, fly or see arterial gore. Wrapping then his upper story, soon developed bumps it bore, and reasoning a posteriori, his unmentionables tore. He seemed like some lone wreck, Here the spell was broken by Ethan Spike, who exclaimed in tones of thunder, Sarved him right! By this interruption we have been deprived, judging of the fragment before us, of that which, quote, the world would not willingly let die. Ethan himself regretted it, but said that, quote, the strain was so moving he couldn't hold it in nohow. It's signed D. Now, that pseudonym is disputed, and this is where we get into a little trouble. But look at what the poem is. This is spousal abuse. It's roughly in the same style as The Raven, but it's just awful. It's awful magnified by 10 times. So Matthew is writing a caricature, a parody of the poem that had appeared in the transcript that was supposedly channeled, see? So now the introduction here, which I don't think I read, it says, at a late meeting of the Circle in Hornby, Jeff Jenkins, a trance medium, rose and uttered the following lines in an unconscious state. As Jeff is a man of small cerebrum and can neither read nor write, might they not have been suggested by the spirit of Edgar A. Poe? So in Matthew's example, he's separating out these factors. He's making it clear that Jeff Jenkins couldn't possibly have written it. And his purpose in doing that is, first off, he doesn't really want to challenge spiritualism per se. And secondly, he's directly attacking Edgar Allan Poe. So he takes that factor out. Now, we have got to deal with the pseudonym D. And first, I'm going to show you some of the evidence that Mathew Franklin Whittier was the author of D. It's a pseudonym that he had brought back from 1831 when he was editing for, or being the assistant editor for, the New York Constellation. I've shown this before. I'll go through it very briefly. This is an edition of the New York Constellation. This happens to be the first edition in 1831, January 1st, 1831. And there's evidence in here which shows that the editor-in-chief, Asa Green, was not the only person writing original material for this newspaper, the New York Constellation. On the second page, top left, we have an announcement by the publishers, who are Lord and Bartlett. And they say, Dr. Green, having resumed the editorial charge of the Constellation, it will in future be conducted by him as principal editor, assisted by the gentleman who has furnished the editorial matter for the last 3 numbers. Now, there's a certain style that we see throughout this paper, a humorous style. And if we look at the last 3 numbers, we know now that those things were probably not written by Asa Green. He could have left stuff on file, so we'll grant that. But basically, the original material in the previous 3 editions, we can assume was not written by Asa Green. And it is precisely that style that we see throughout the paper that's creative and humorous and, slightly sarcastic and so on. And although Matthew isn't named, it's been Matthew who has been the de facto editor of this paper, as I believe, since at least the middle of the previous year, 1830. Now, as of this edition, Mathew starts signing D. Now, whether this stands for a printer's devil or whether it stands for Diogenes, the seeker of one honest man, I would guess it's Diogenes, or it could be a little of both. You know, that they called him the devil because he was mischievous and stirred up trouble with contrary opinions. And then he took D as Diogenes, and it evolved from there. But on the third page, we've got a piece signed D in this edition. And I think that's all in this one. But now we have, let me put this one away. I'll show you another edition that has more of D in it. I have 5 of these originals. Again, D starts in 31. This is the April 2nd, 1831 edition. And this is kind of interesting because Mathew would print his brother's poetry, John Greenleaf Whittier. He would print his poetry in this newspaper to give him more exposure as of 1831, and his prose. So here we have Legends of New England, like 2.5 columns worth of Legends of New England written by Mathew's brother that he has put on the first page. So that's another piece of evidence that this is Mathew Franklin Whittier, because he's helping to promote his brother. But we have other pieces by Mathew in here, including where the editorial column normally would be under, I don't know what they call this, some people call it the masthead, depends on whether you're in England or America, but it's where they have the editorial column, the name of the paper, who it's edited by, says A. Green, and then the date. So in that spot, we have something signed Peter Pendergrass. Mathew's nickname as a boy was Peter Pumpkin. He would use all kinds of variations. I've listed like 23 different ones that he used over the course of his career. Peter Pumple, and here we have Peter Pendergrass. And it's a series, this is letter 2, of celestial correspondence. This is somebody who goes to the moon and reports the inhabitants of the moon and so on. This is before Edgar Allan Poe ever wrote about anybody going to the moon. This is kind of, I would say, roughly inspired by Gulliver's Travels. It's kind of like Gulliver's Travels, you know, brought into the modern day, quote unquote, with space travel, and rockets are steam powered and so on. So that's Mathew in this paper also. There's another one on the next page, The Apprentice and the Ghost, that's signed D. So Mathew was the de facto editor of this paper, and he signed, some of his work is unsigned, some of it has other signatures, but a lot of it, as of 1831, is signed D. And there's other instances of this, but basically, as of 1861, Mathew, even though he's writing about Ethan Spike and Hornby, he's been outed. He's been exposed publicly as Ethan Spike as of 1857, and he's being blacklisted in Portland, I believe, because of it. So he doesn't necessarily want to sign it as Ethan Spike. So he brings back an old pseudonym from the 1830s, early 1830s, D. So that was Mathew. However, Mathew had a friend named Nathaniel Deering, who they were both members of the Nixian Club. I think that's how it's pronounced, P-N-Y-X-I-A-N. It was a debate club. They were both members of that. My gut feeling is very strong looking at Nathaniel Deering's picture, which you'll see here. And that was that he mentored Mathew. He was quite a bit older than Mathew. He was wealthy. He's like one of the city patrons. And he took Mathew under his wing and helped him through the first months of terrible grief after he had lost Abby in March of 1841. So I have a very, very fond feeling, regard for Nathaniel Deering. Mathew, in one of his letters to his brother, called him Old Nat, which you'll see. I'll put that up on the screen. So there was a lot of affection there, obviously. I don't need too much more evidence for that, but this is not a case, I don't think, where Nathaniel Deering was a traitor and betrayed Mathew by falsely claiming his work. However, his primary biographer, Leola Bowie Chaplin, was of the opinion that a lot of Mathew's pieces were actually written by Nathaniel Deering, and she takes this pseudonym D, where it appears, as standing for Deering. Now, what they're going on is Nathaniel Deering's papers. They found clippings, in his scrapbook. Well, Nathaniel Deering was known to be a fan of Ethan Spike and Hornby, and he even wrote at least one kind of spin-off or derivative, of Hornby. So we know he was a fan, and he was a writer, a playwright, and so on. But these pieces that they're citing for him, signed D, were actually written by Mathew. They were not actually written by Nathaniel Deering. This is the Maine Bulletin, August 1934, number 1, University of Maine Studies, second series, number 32. It's the life and works of Nathaniel Deering, 1791 to 1881. And it has the text of some of Nathaniel Deering's plays. And basically the whole edition is taken up with this. And I'll show you just a little bit of the mistakes that have been made. Here's a poem signed D called The Campaign that is supporting Lincoln's candidacy and his campaign for presidency. And Mathew had written to his son that he was going to try to help Lincoln's campaign. So this apparently is one of the ways that Mathew was trying to assist Lincoln in getting elected. So I'm going to read just a little bit of this. In the Portland transcript of 1 December 1860, there had appeared, quote, a remarkable poem which had been recited by Miss Lizzie Doughton, a, quote, spiritual trance speaker, at the close of a lecture in Boston. She had said it was impromptu and spoken while she was under the influence of Edgar Allan Poe. Succeeding transcripts had contained a heated controversy regarding the plausibility of her statement. Seizing an opportunity to amuse himself, where people impugn motives. This is the key place to look to see if there's a problem, if there's a discrepancy. Here, she's assuming that Nathaniel Deering was just amused, whereas Mathew had a much deeper motive in ridiculing this poem because he was, furious at Edgar Allan Poe for having falsely claimed the raven. So Mathew had much more cause to write this. It also is in Mathew's style and Mathew's sensibilities. Nathaniel Deering wasn't known for such cutting, biting humor or violence. All of this has Mathew Franklin Whittier all over it, this poem about the blower. Anyway, she says, this poem relates to the story of Jenkins, an ignorant drunken husband, etc., etc. She summarizes it. And then she goes into a little history, what she believes is the history. The humorous character of Ethan Spike of Hornby had been created in a series of letters which Mathew F. Whittier, brother of the poet, they always call him brother of the poet, had been contributing more or less regularly to the Portland transcript since 1846. Actually, there was a long period where after the first one in the transcript, he went to the Boston Chronotype, so she's mistaken there. Mr. Whittier was a resident of Portland at this time, which actually he was not. He was a resident of New York City. He had left Portland, supported his second wife and children from New York City, and visited Portland. Since 1846, Mr. Whittier was a resident of Portland at this time and a member of the Nixian Club that was actually earlier, to which Deering belonged. These letters had made the fictitious town of Hornby in Oxford County and its people, particularly Spike, so well known that other writers began to send Hornby sketches to the transcript. Someone under the pseudonym of Poins wrote Mesmerism or some account of the rise and progress of animal magnetism in Hornby. That was in, I believe, 1843, and that was Mathew. I can prove that Mathew was Poins, so she's mistaken on this. And A. Melissa Peasley wrote a series of letters from Gobbletown, which she represented as being next to Waterford and very near Hornby. I'm not familiar with those. Those could have been written by Mathew. They could have been written by an imitator. She brings in the characters of Ethan Spike and Artemis Ward. I'll have to look for that because I suspect that could also be Mathew. He loved to branch out, do spin-offs, He would get bored with a particular character or a particular premise, and he would move to a spin-off. Deering himself, in his poems and sketches during the next few years, frequently manifested interest in Spike and Hornby. In the touching ballad of Nancy Bean and the Maine Recruit, a broadside printed in 1861, Nancy is represented as moving from Portland to Hornby. In Mr. Botkin's Rises in the World, which was printed in the Northern Monthly in 1864, Mr. Botkin's father is mentioned as a corporal in the Hornby Blues. That one, I think, was written by Nathaniel Deering. It's kind of a spin-off that's not in Hornby, and it's pretty bad. It's really not funny. It just falls flat. So, Deering was a fan, and he loved Mathew, I think, as kind of an adopted son, but he wasn't nearly the writer that Mathew was. And I think Mathew didn't want to hurt his feelings. I mean, it was extremely important to him not to hurt Nathaniel Deering's feelings, and he would just take it, and praise where he could, So a lot of these things were actually Mathew's. At least one of them, I think, was Deering's. When they talk about, she goes on and says, in addition to these, there are 2 actual Hornby sketches by Deering. They were by Mathew, the Hornby Scientific Soci and the Hornby Lyceum, both of which were printed in the transcript in 1864. I couldn't find the Hornby Lyceum in 1864. All of this apparently is based on going through Nathaniel Deering's effects, his papers, and finding things in his scrapbook and assuming that he had written them because they were signed D and so forth. So it's a case where, it's just not adequate scholarship because they didn't have enough information. Let's see what I have missed here, if anything. I think all we really need to do is to go back and analyze that poem, and then I'm going to briefly show any of you who remain here on other instances in which Mathew juxtaposed or combined his different pseudonyms so as to show that he was the author of both, or at least that was part of his motivation. For all time, if people knew that he was Ethan Spike and he combined Ethan Spike with something else, then posterity knows that he wrote the other one, see? So I'm going to give you a couple examples of that. But let's go back through this poem, The Haunted Room. I'm looking at this from a psychological and spiritual point of view. I'm not really, I have a sense of what's good poetry and what isn't, but I have no training in that area, so I'm not going to try to analyze this as poetry. I would say it's pretty bad. It's certainly not the world-class poetry that Mr. Cana Fides says it is, but I'm not going to go there. We're going to look at this from the point of view of the understanding of the person who's written it and just its internal consistency from a spiritual and psychological point of view. Now, the lover has returned. We know in spiritualism that when loved ones return, and you can find this in a million different psychic readings which have so many hits in them that you know that this is genuine, like what Matt Fraser does, for example. When loved ones return, they love you. They're pouring love. If they don't speak, they're pouring love from their being and from their eyes, and they may speak to you telepathically, and they've come to reassure you and to give their love, see? So here, her former lover, his eyes gaze on me, only now how passionless and cold. Well, that's BS. Okay, right there we know this person is not a genuine spiritualist. She has no clue what she's talking about. She's imagining that because the person had died, now when their shade comes back, he's passionless and cold. So right, we won't really need to go any further because we know that she has no idea what she's talking about and she's making it all up. Now, whether she has memorized this poem, there's no reason to assume she couldn't have. So I'm assuming that she did memorize it and she put on a big act and pretended to be trance channeling. Easiest thing in the world. So here we have, it paused. Now she says it, not he. So, that's nonsense. It paused beneath a picture rare where long and long ago I sat with one, God guard his soul, who loved me then, I know. Now, this is a phrase, God guard his soul. But God is obviously doing a terrible job of guarding this guy's soul if he's like stuck, earthbound, or comes back as a passionless, cold, shade. God is not guarding his soul very well. But this is the last that this momentous issue is mentioned. See, so it's just passed off as a phrase without any meaning. And then this business about the picture, Eros and Psyche weeping, love parting from its soul, tears, lovers' tears. That was the tale. It was all, sensationalized crap, in other words. Let's see. Whose grave, sad eyes were watching me, whose hands still clasped my own. And so on. And then she faints. And then after she faints, she doesn't dare go back into the room because he's still standing there. So he's still in the room, and she just avoids the room. Well, it's all utter nonsense, okay? I don't think I need to go into this any further. I mean, Matthew would have been incensed at the pretense, the fraud, and he would have been still incensed at Edgar Allan Poe. And this poem, The Blower, was the obvious response to it. It was not written by Nathaniel Deering. Now, I think this brings up the point that the historical record is so badly garbled as a result of Matthew creating a huge hole in it. Matthew refusing to acknowledge his own works and hiding the way he did and writing under a pseudonym and refusing to even defend his works if they were plagiarized or falsely claimed. For example, when Francis Durivage and George Burnham swindled Matthew, as I have gathered, out of his entire unpublished portfolio and published it all under their own names and under their own pseudonyms, Matthew was so good a writer, so creative, so original, that his response was to just write another one. He wrote The Mistake of a Lifetime and published it 2 years later in 1850 that blew everything else he'd ever written out of the water. He was that good that he could say, okay, you've got my entire portfolio, but I'm going to outdo you. And he outdid them, I think, with an agent anonymously in their own publication, which is to say with their own publisher, who was Frederick Gleason. They had been publishing the bulk of this work in The Flag of Our Union and Gleason's Pictorial, which were owned by Frederick Gleason, a conservative outfit. I think Gleason was a conservative, and Matthew normally would never darken their doors. But to get back at Durivage and Burnham, he wrote The Mistake of a Lifetime, and he got Gleason through an agent. He got Gleason to pay $3,000 plus royalties for that book. So he got back at them. Okay. Matthew was that good that if his work was stolen, he'd just write another one, you know. So now let's go into a few examples in which this is kind of anticlimactical, but let's go into a few examples in which Matthew would combine his pseudonyms, which he has done here. He has brought in Ethan Spike, and he's juxtaposed it with the Raven. Okay, and so we'll use some other examples. When he was writing as Quails for the Boston Weekly Museum, this was a travelogue, although he broke off from the travelogue to submit several humorous sketches, precisely in the same style as the material that Durivage and Burnham had stolen, which is another example of juxtaposing, because under the pseudonym of Quails, suddenly Matthew was writing stories exactly in the same style and of the same quality as the ones that Durivage and Burnham had stolen. See? But so he's here as Quails, and he writes one story in which Quails visits with Edwin Plummer on Exchange Street in Portland. I was just walking right past there yesterday on Exchange Street in Portland. He visits Edwin Plummer, the editor of a relatively new newspaper, The Eclectic, and he says he would like to, as though he was just visiting Portland, see, Quails, and he says he would like to visit Ethan Spike, that he understands Ethan Spike lives there. And Edwin Plummer says, yes, I can take you to him. I can arrange it. So the two of them head on up Exchange Street to Congress Street, and that's where Matthew lived at the time. I know that because there's a notice of a fire in 1852, in April 1852, about that. So he lived right on the route that they walked to see Ethan Spike. So here, Matthew has combined Quails and Ethan Spike in such a way that posterity will know that it was written by the same person, even though playfully he describes Ethan Spike to look like Ashen Dodge, who's the person that historians think wrote it. So Matthew was being mischievous, but Ethan Spike was not Ashen Dodge. Nobody thinks that Ashen Dodge wrote Ethan Spike. They all know and agree that Mathew Franklin Whittier wrote Ethan Spike. So he combined Quails and Ethan Spike. It's not the only time he did that. I've shown you how Matthew signed his D in the Constellation. Now, there's one piece in the Constellation, the January 21st, 1832 edition, and he signed it D, and it's called No Ear for Music. And by my lights, it's a caricature of Albert Pike. Now, he had a bone to pick with Albert Pike because Albert Pike was a classroom teacher in 1830 in Newburyport, Massachusetts. Near as I can tell, Abby, Matthew's future wife, at age 14, was attending that class. She wrote exceptional poetry in that class, and Albert Pike apparently got into her workbook and stole her poetry and published it as his own. They had the same initials, AP, and where you'll see Albert Pike supposedly famous for the Hymns to the Gods series, that was most of that. A couple, 3 of them, or however a few of them were written by Albert Pike to flesh the series out, but most of those were written by Abby Poyen, the future Abby Poyen Whittier. So Matthew knew that Albert Pike was a horrific plagiarist, and but this was even before that happened, because in the D-signed piece, No Ear for Music, he alludes to the fact that he had written that several years earlier. Well, I looked for it. He says it was in the Galaxy, okay? I know that Matthew started writing for the Galaxy when he was 12 years old in 1825. And in fact, I went back and I looked in the Galaxy and I found it. And it really hasn't been modified very much. Let's see if I have the date here. August 26th, 1825 edition of the Galaxy. And that same story, No Ear for Music, is in there. See, Matthew grew up in Haverhill, Massachusetts. Albert Pike grew up in Newburyport, Massachusetts, which was very near. Very likely they knew each other. I think that Albert Pike was a bully and they were enemies. They were both tall, but Albert Pike was 2 or 3 years older. And Matthew had a bone to pick. So he kind of loosely represented Albert Pike in this story. And it was prophetic because he has Albert Pike getting in trouble with one of the local girls, see, as a teacher. And that's exactly what happened to Albert Pike, even though he lied about it. But anyway, this is one way that we can know that Matthew was, in fact, the author signing D in the New York constellation, because in the January 21st, 1832 edition, signing as D, he brings back this story, No Ear for Music, which he himself had written for the August 26, 1825 New England Galaxy. So, that's another smoking gun that Matthew has combined these two things. He's combined work that he did for the constellation, signing as D, with work that he had done in the New England Galaxy back when he was, let's see, how old would he have been? 12 or 13. Just barely 13 years old, because his birthday is July 18. This is August 26, 1825. Now, in order to go by the official historical record, one would have to assume that Asa Green was writing for the New England Galaxy in August 26, 1825, in order to claim that he was the person writing as D in the constellation. But there's no evidence to show that Asa Green was writing for the Galaxy. There's a whole ton of evidence showing that Mathew Franklin Whittier, as a boy of 12 and 13 and 14, was writing for the New England Galaxy in Boston. That was a major literary newspaper, by the way. So we see that Matthew was really a child prodigy, because he started out at age 12 publishing not just in little dinky hometown newspapers like an awful lot of prominent people did. He started publishing in a major Boston literary newspaper, the New England Galaxy, right out of the gate. So there you have it. What this means is this poem, The Blower, as a parody, it means that Mathew Franklin Whittier, signing D, bringing back his old pseudonym, was writing a caricature of Edgar Allan Poe's supposed authorship of The Raven. And it's by itself, it may not seem that compelling, but this is to be taken with the other 17, 18, 20 clues, which I have incorporated into my paper on this subject, my 59-page paper. This clue isn't in that paper, at least as of now. I haven't put it in there. I think 59 pages worth of evidence should be enough for anybody, but it's one more, it's a nail in the coffin, okay? It's one more example that Edgar Allan Poe never wrote The Raven, that it was always Mathew Franklin Whittier's poem, and that Poe, through an outrageous brazen act of identity theft, falsely claimed it, knowing, I believe, that Matthew was not going to be able to defend himself publicly because he was so deeply involved in the abolitionist movement. Now, one thing occurred to me, where Matthew, writing as Quails, talks about receiving what we would now call the Ultima Thule portrait of Edgar Allan Poe. He says that, I don't have it in front of me, but he says that Poe was ever ready to take advantage of a brother's weakness. And that's code to me that says that Poe knew very well that Matthew would not be able to defend himself. And the logical scenario behind that would be that Poe was a Southerner and he was involved with the undercover world of the South, the pro-slavery elements. He was in touch with those people. And he knew through the grapevine that Matthew was working for the anti-slavery, the abolitionists, and connected with the Underground Railroad and so on. And they wanted to force him out from undercover. They wanted to force him out in the open. The way to do that was to steal his poem and to force him to come out and defend his poem. Once it became a lawsuit, which Poe would have sued him, then it would have forced Matthew to reveal his activities. It would have come out in the course of the civil trial, see? Well, Matthew knew he couldn't do that because he had connections with the Underground Railroad. It would have meant death to any number of people had he spilled the beans, had he, been investigated, in other words. So he had to let Poe take the poem. And then what he did was he would leave posterity certain coded clues in his subsequent writings showing that, in fact, he was the author and that Poe had stolen it, which he did and which I have gone into in some depth in my paper and in more depth in my books, Mathew Franklin Whittier in His Own Words and Mathew Franklin Whittier in His Own World.